She signed out, an hour after she was found. Welcome to Mystery's Notebook. I am your host, Elspeth. Where in the world are you joining from? Comment below. Your voices make this journey unforgettable. Let's begin. It began, as it so often did in the village of St. Leonard's Mead, with a perfectly ordinary invitation. A garden luncheon at the home of Mrs. Lavinia Gray, widow of the late Canon Gray, and an enthusiastic hostess ever since she discovered a passion for rhododendrons. The table was set beneath a blooming wisteria arbor, linen tablecloth fluttering in the mild breeze, and a small gathering of respectable ladies sat sipping chilled elderflower cordial and commenting on everything from the vicar's new sermon series to the rising price of sugar. Miss Marple was there, of course, seated in her usual position at the corner, a modest smile on her face, knitting something in a calm and practiced rhythm. The younger women always underestimated her. The older ones knew better, but still found her disarmingly pleasant. "I heard Nurse Phelps has moved into the White Cottage," said Mrs. Caroline Edgeworth, lowering her voice. "You know, the little house at the edge of Ash Lane." "Indeed," said Miss Marple without looking up from her needles. "Rather sudden, wasn't it? The Forsters had barely finished packing." "She's a private nurse," said Lavinia, her voice clipped. "Fresh from London, I hear. Between jobs. Recuperating, perhaps." "Or hiding," said Caroline under her breath. At that very moment, a boy from the village, a slight lad with scabbed knees and the remnants of jam at the corner of his mouth, ran breathless into the garden and blurted, "Excuse me, Mrs. Gray. Sorry, miss. Dr. Hayden said to come quick. It's the nurse. She's not answering." The stillness that followed was thick and unnatural. Even the bees around the hollyhocks seemed to pause. "What do you mean?" asked Mrs. Gray, rising. The boy looked down at his feet. Old man Denton said he's seen her curtains drawn since yesterday, and milk bottles stacking up outside. Miss Marple's knitting paused, just for a heartbeat. "I suppose," she said softly, "we'd better go see." They found Nurse Phelps moments later. The door had been unlocked, oddly. Inside, the little cottage was warm and still, tea things laid out, and a book fallen on the floor beside a pale blue armchair. The nurse sat slumped awkwardly in the chair, one hand hanging limply by her side. Her head lolled unnaturally, eyes closed, expression oddly serene. At first glance, she might have simply passed in her sleep. But Miss Marple, lingering near the hearth, her eyes scanning not the body but the small, tidy surroundings, frowned. "There's no cup for the tea," she murmured, mostly to herself. Dr. Hayden arrived moments later, flustered and red-faced. He confirmed what most had already sensed. "Gone," he said shortly. "Likely in the night. Heart failure, perhaps. I'll notify the coroner." "But she was young, wasn't she?" asked Lavinia Gray in a thin voice. "Early 30s?" "Indeed," said Miss Marple, still watching the hearth. "And very careful, I should think." "What do you mean?" asked the doctor. Miss Marple turned to him, her voice mild. "Well, one wouldn't let fresh-cut tulips sit out of water overnight, would one? And yet, they are." They all turned, following her gaze to a small vase of wilted tulips on the windowsill. The blooms hung their heads as if in mourning. That evening, the village buzzed like a disturbed hive. At the butcher's counter, Mrs. Edgeworth claimed the nurse had once been involved in a scandal at a London hospital. Down by the post office, Mr. Swithins swore he'd seen a shadowy figure leaving the White Cottage just before dawn. Meanwhile, Mrs. Hawthorne whispered to her husband that the nurse had received letters, odd-looking ones in heavy cream envelopes with no return address. Back in her sitting room, Miss Marple sat quietly in her high-backed chair, a single lamp casting soft light on the latest issue of the Times. But her eyes weren't on the crossword. She was remembering the tea tray. No cup for the nurse, no lipstick smudge, no stray hair on the saucer. The sugar bowl untouched, the water in the kettle cold and full, and the tulips wilting, unwatered. A woman meticulous about her tea, her flowers and her routine, and yet suddenly careless in her final hours. No, Miss Marple thought. No, that doesn't sit quite right. She looked out the window, across the quiet village lane. Someone had wanted Nurse Phelps to seem alone, to seem natural in her departure. And someone had been in that cottage after she died. Miss Marple resumed her knitting. There would be more to this than an unfortunate death. Of that, she was sure. And in a place as small and polite as St. Leonard's Mead, where secrets were buried in every garden bed, it would only take one mistake, one misplaced glance or flippant word, for the whole truth to bloom. The following morning brought with it a soft mist that clung to the hedgerows and hung low over the cobbled lanes of St. Leonard's Mead. The milkman's cart made its usual rounds, and the chime of the church bell echoed like a polite reminder that life must carry on, no matter what shadow had crept into it the day before. But the village, for all its routines and niceties, had changed in some small, invisible way. People spoke in lowered tones, curtains twitched more often than usual. And everywhere, people asked the same question with varying degrees of earnestness or gossip. What had happened to Nurse Phelps? Miss Marple, of course, did not engage in speculation. She listened. At the greengrocer's, she listened to Mrs. Berridge speculate that it must have been a suicide. Too much stress from hospital work, perhaps. At the chemist's, she heard young Mary Leeming whisper that she'd seen a man standing at the edge of the nurse's garden 2 nights prior. A stranger in a dark coat, just standing there, she said, her eyes wide with adolescent fear and excitement. Miss Marple did not comment. She simply purchased her rhubarb and aspirin, nodded thoughtfully, and walked back to her cottage on Church Hill, with her mind already a few streets ahead. Back home, she sat by her mantel with a small notebook on her lap. Not for taking notes, heaven forbid, no. That would be far too obvious. But it helped her to write out recipes and remind herself of things like cut lavender or return library books, while her mind sifted through much more subtle details. The first point she returned to was this. Nurse Phelps had not intended to die. A woman who arranges tulips but leaves them to wither overnight. Number that did not fit. Nor did the untouched tea tray, and the front door had been unlocked, not just left ajar in forgetfulness, but properly, quietly unlocked. Miss Marple recalled, years ago, the case of poor Mr. Denning's wife. Everyone had said she'd fallen down the stairs in the night, but it was the small detail, a sugar bowl placed slightly out of alignment on the breakfast tray, that had told her something was wrong. That case had ended with an arrest, and a confession, and a rather tragic scandal involving the gardener. People always showed their guilt in the smallest, quietest ways. That evening, Constable Hargreaves came calling, a serious young man with very clean shoes and a tremendous respect for Miss Marple, though he never quite admitted it aloud. "We've had the coroner's report, Miss Marple," he said, removing his cap. "Heart failure, they're calling it. Possibly something congenital." "I see," she said, pouring him a cup of tea. "And was anything unusual found?" He hesitated. No sign of struggle. No injuries, but... He paused again. The doctor mentioned something odd about the lips, a touch of bluish tint. Could be consistent with natural causes. Could be something else. "Something ingested?" Miss Marple asked gently. He blinked at her. "Yes, potentially. Though there was no glass or cup near the body, so we're still unsure." Miss Marple stirred her tea and looked thoughtful. "You know, I found it curious that there was no teacup at all. One sets a tray. One expects a cup, especially a nurse." Hargreaves nodded. "We've collected the contents of the cottage. The lab's checking everything, still waiting." "Ah," said Miss Marple, "but time has a way of whispering truths while everyone else shouts speculation." The constable looked puzzled, but wisely didn't press. Later that week, Miss Marple paid a visit to the cottage on Ash Lane. It had been sealed, but she had asked the vicar's wife, who had some influence with the parish council, to accompany her on a pastoral inspection of the premises. Between them, they had every right to be there. and a gentle knock at the door was all it took to be let in by a rather distracted parish clerk. Inside, the cottage felt abandoned, but not unlived in. There was a faint scent of lavender and starch, and the walls still held the warmth of a woman who had kept tidy routines. Miss Marple's eyes passed over the mantel, the bookshelf, the little clock ticking softly beside the armchair. The book that had fallen on the floor had been replaced. She tilted her head and examined the spine, the portrait of a lady by Henry James. A curious choice, she thought. Not for being unreadable, oh, far from it, but for what it suggested about Nurse Phelps. A woman who read about complex inner lives and unseen motives. Someone observant, perhaps even cautious. On the small table, beside a bowl of now shriveled fruit, sat a stack of letters bound neatly with twine. The clerk, seeing her gaze, said, "Those are hers." Addressed, but not sent. Might be personal. "Indeed," said Miss Marple, feigning disinterest. When the clerk went to fetch something from the next room, she leaned slightly closer. The top letter was addressed to a Mr. T. Sandwell, the second, to a Mrs. Anthea Gray. The third, more curious still, had no name, just an address in Brighton, scrawled with what seemed like haste. By the time the clerk returned, she was at the bookshelf, her hand resting lightly on a worn copy of Gray's Anatomy. "Such an organized young woman," she said pleasantly. "Yes," the clerk agreed. "Bit quiet, though. Kept to herself mostly." "Did she have visitors?" Miss Marple asked, already knowing the answer. The clerk hesitated. "Once or twice. A man, I think. Tall, well-dressed. Didn't give his name." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "Did he come at night?" "Usually dusk," said the clerk, shifting. "Didn't stay long. I suppose I thought it might be a brother." "But you don't know for sure?" "No, miss." Miss Marple nodded slowly and turned back toward the door. "Well, thank you. I won't take up any more of your time." As she stepped out into the grey drizzle that had begun to fall, she allowed herself a small sigh. The details were beginning to align, like the edge pieces of a puzzle, but the centre was still elusive. Someone had visited Nurse Phelps, someone she hadn't entirely trusted, judging by the letters she hadn't posted, and someone who had been careful, very careful, not to leave signs behind. She paused at the gate, turning to look back at the cottage. "I do wonder," she murmured, whether she knew she wouldn't be alive long enough to post those letters, or whether someone had made certain of it. The mist curled round her ankles as she walked away, her cane tapping gently on the stone path. Behind her, the white cottage stood silent. But its silence, Miss Marple thought, was beginning to speak. 2 days later, the village found itself caught between the rhythms of habit and the pull of uncertainty. The church held its usual Wednesday service, and the bakery still opened at 8 sharp with its display of warm scones and treacle tart. But a new undercurrent ran beneath it all, a quiet dread, laced with curiosity. The kind that made people glance over their shoulders or pause a beat too long at the postbox, listening for something unspoken. At the post office, Miss Marple stood before the rack of greeting cards, her fingers drifting over a sympathy card with violets on the cover. She did not intend to buy one. Her attention was not on the cards at all. It was on the conversation happening behind her. "She was a nurse, wasn't she?" whispered Mrs. Sylvia Mott, whose niece worked as a part-time cleaner at the surgery. "You'd think she'd have known her own symptoms if it was her heart." "Oh, but that's just it," murmured Miss Fenwick, ever breathless with excitement. "They say she was worried, had gone to see Dr. Hayden the week before, complained of dizzy spells." "Did he find anything?" "Nothing definite," said Fenwick, "just told her to rest." Miss Marple stepped away quietly and made her purchase, a book of stamps and a tin of barley sugar, and thanked the postmistress with her usual politeness. But she was already walking the path of thought. Dizzy spells, a visit to the doctor, a warning sign perhaps, or a ruse. And if so, by whom? The morning air had turned brisk as she made her way to Dr. Hayden's surgery, His building sat neatly at the end of the high street, a modest structure with climbing ivy and a brass plate polished daily by his housekeeper. Miss Marple didn't need an appointment to speak to him. She'd once nursed his mother through a nasty bout of pneumonia in the spring of '42, and such kindness was never forgotten. He welcomed her into his office with a weary smile. "You've come about Nurse Phelps." Miss Marple inclined her head. "I know she consulted you shortly before her passing." He folded his hands, then unfolded them. "She did. Complained of feeling faint. I examined her. Pulse, lungs, blood pressure, all unremarkable. Did you order tests?" He hesitated. "I suggested she see a specialist in London. She declined." "Did she mention any recent shocks? Changes in her routine?" "She said she'd recently ended a private nursing contract in Sussex. One that had gone badly. She didn't elaborate." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened slightly. "I see." Dr. Hayden leaned forward. "Jane, I must tell you something off the record. During the post-mortem, the coroner noted a trace, just a trace of digitalis." Her brow lifted. "Foxglove?" He nodded grimly. "In its pure form, yes. Enough to cause arrhythmia, but subtle. Could have been administered in tea or food." "Or by someone with medical access and knowledge," she said. Dr. Hayden hesitated. "It's not enough to declare murder, but it's enough to raise questions." Miss Marple sat very still. "And is anyone else aware?" "I've told the constable." Quietly. Miss Marple took her leave a few minutes later, her thoughts now turning like a mill wheel in motion. Digitalis. It wasn't a poison of impulse. It was deliberate, controlled. Someone would need access, and more importantly, intent. She spent the afternoon in her garden. To any passerby, she looked like she was inspecting the sweet peas or pruning the roses. But in her mind, she was revisiting every name, every face connected to the nurse. By evening, she had decided to take a small liberty. The Brighton letter. She remembered the address perfectly. Years of knitting had sharpened her eye for patterns and details. She wrote a brief note introducing herself as a close acquaintance of Nurse Phelps and inquired delicately if the recipient might have any recent contact with her. Then she added her return address and walked it to the postbox by the gate. She posted it before the last collection. 3 days later, the reply arrived. She recognized the envelope immediately. A neat hand, no sender's name, and postmarked Brighton. Inside, a single page read, "Dear Miss Marple, I am saddened but not entirely surprised to hear of Judith's passing. We were friends once, close in fact. But we had not spoken in some time. Our last contact was strained. She mentioned that someone from her previous placement had followed her to the village. She was frightened, though she wouldn't say who. I hope this helps in some way. A G." A chill prickled at Miss Marple's neck. A.G. The second letter she'd glimpsed at the cottage was addressed to a Mrs. Anthea Gray. That night, she visited Vicar Goodchild. He was a soft-spoken man with an encyclopedic knowledge of parish records and an enduring fondness for Miss Marple's sponge cake. "I wondered," she asked him casually over tea, "if anyone else recently took up residence nearby, particularly near Ash Lane." The vicar rubbed his chin. "There was a man, let me think, yes, Mr. Elias Grange, moved into the old weaver's barn, converted now into a little studio cottage. Keeps to himself mostly. Writer, I believe." "Has he attended church?" "Not once," she nodded. "Did Nurse Phelps know him?" The vicar looked surprised. "It's possible. Their cottages are only 3 doors apart." Miss Marple thanked him and walked home with her shawl pulled tight. She did not yet know if this Elias Grange was the figure Mary Leeming had seen in the garden, but she suspected it. A man who moved quietly, kept to himself, and arrived not long after Nurse Phelps. That evening, she rang Constable Hargreaves. "Would you do me a kindness?" she asked. "I'd like to know more about Mr. Elias Grange, when he arrived, where he came from, and whether he's had any dealings with the medical profession." Hargreaves was silent a moment, then said, You think he may be tied to it? I think, said Miss Marple, that he's not as quiet as he seems. By morning, the constable had returned with news. Grange arrived 6 weeks ago, says he's writing a book. No prior criminal record, but he worked as a pharmacist assistant in Sussex until recently. Left under a cloud, something about prescription irregularities. Miss Marple closed her eyes. And was Nurse Phelps working in Sussex before arriving here? She was, said Hargreaves. Private contract, no details listed, but I've written to the agency. Thank you, said Miss Marple, her voice quiet. I believe we may be on the verge of a most unpleasant truth. As she replaced the receiver, her gaze drifted toward the window and the creeping ivy outside. In a village like St. Leonard's Mead, evil never arrived with a shout. It crept. It smiled. It poured tea and offered flowers. But Miss Marple had seen it before, and she would see it again. The news about Elias Grange simmered beneath the surface of the village like a pot kept just shy of boiling. To the casual observer, nothing appeared amiss. He continued his daily walks along the hedgerows, always with a book under one arm and a slight nod to the baker if they passed on the lane. But to Miss Marple, every step he took, every movement, was now under quiet examination. The next day, Miss Marple made her way to the cottage of Mary Leeming, the teenage girl who had claimed to have seen a man loitering near Nurse Phelps's home the week of her death. Mary's mother answered the door, wiping her hands on a floral apron. Mary's just upstairs, Miss Marple. Shall I fetch her? No need, dear, Miss Marple said gently. I'll just speak with her for a moment, if I may. Mary came bounding down, all freckles and long limbs, her curiosity visibly outpacing her nervousness. I was hoping you might help me, Miss Marple began, settling into the kitchen chair. You mentioned before that you saw a man near the White Cottage. Mary nodded quickly. Yes, ma'am. Just after supper. It was Thursday evening. I remember 'cause we'd had corned beef hash, and Mum said it was too salty again. And you're certain it wasn't someone from the village? I'd never seen him before. He was tall, kind of hunched, like he didn't want to be noticed. Stood across the road from Nurse Phelps's garden gate for ages, then walked off toward the footpath near the woods. Did he go into her house? No, ma'am. Least, not that I saw, but he kept looking at it. Did you notice anything else? Something he carried? Wore? Mary scrunched up her face in concentration. Dark coat, black maybe, and gloves. That was odd. I remember that now. He had gloves on, even though it was warm. Miss Marple smiled, thanked her kindly, and offered a few words of praise that sent the girl's cheeks pink with pride. Back home, Miss Marple made a note of the detail. Gloves in warm weather. A careful man, then. Someone who didn't intend to leave prints. Someone who knew what mattered and what must not be left behind. That afternoon, Constable Hargreaves came round again, his expression a little grimmer than usual. I've had a reply from the agency Nurse Phelps worked through in Sussex, he said. Turns out her last patient was an older gentleman, retired solicitor. He had a stroke last year and hired Nurse Phelps for in-home care. Man's name was Gordon Stanning. Died 4 months ago. Natural causes? Possibly. But the timing is peculiar. The death came after a brief recovery. They'd just changed his medication. Guess who handled the prescriptions? Miss Marple's eyes met his. Elias Grange. Exactly. He was working at the local chemist then. There was suspicion he'd altered the dosage of the man's heart medication. Nothing proved, but the family dismissed him quietly. And Nurse Phelps? She stayed until Mr. Stanning passed, left a few weeks after. The agency said she was visibly shaken and had requested a change of location, didn't give a reason. Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. I believe Mr. Grange may have followed her here. Whether out of guilt or something darker, I do not yet know. Hargreaves hesitated. Would he risk poisoning her? I've found that those who commit such crimes tend to believe they're cleverer than everyone else, and when they begin to fear exposure, they act swiftly and quietly. That evening, the two of them walked to the White Cottage once more. Hargreaves had secured permission from the coroner's office to inspect the premises again, now with suspicion formally registered. The front room was as before, orderly, neat, frozen in a strange kind of domestic stasis. But Miss Marple moved with purpose now, her eyes scanning not the obvious, but the overlooked. She opened the writing desk again. The letters were still there. She touched the ribbon gently. She wrote to multiple people, she murmured, but didn't post the letters. Why? Hargreaves shrugged. No time. Or no certainty. She might have feared intercept. Miss Marple knelt at the base of the bookshelf, inspecting the row of titles. She paused near the bottom. What is it? Hargreaves asked. She pointed to a slim, cloth-bound volume tucked out of order. Herbal Compendium, Plants and Remedies of the English Garden. She pulled it out. A scrap of paper slipped from between the pages. She unfolded it slowly. It was a short note, hastily scribbled. I cannot keep this secret. If anything happens to me, it was not natural. J. Judith, Miss Marple said softly. She knew. They took the note into evidence. That night, Miss Marple sat in her parlour, the fireplace flickering gently, her teacup untouched. Her knitting sat beside her, forgotten. Judith Phelps had been frightened. That was clear now. She had left behind quiet messages, breadcrumbs for those who might look closely enough. But they had been subtle, carefully hidden, which meant she hadn't just feared an accident. She feared someone who would make her death look like one. Elias Grange. A man with access, with motive, and with a history that had conveniently disappeared behind closed agency files. But motive was not enough. Miss Marple needed a trigger, something that would either draw him out or confirm her suspicions definitively. She had done such things before, subtle tests, conversations crafted like nets to catch a twitch of the eye or a slip of the tongue. And so she planned a tea. 2 days later, a polite note arrived at Mr. Grange's cottage. Dear Mr. Grange, I've heard from our vicar that you are a writer, and I've always had a fondness for literary conversation. Would you be so kind as to take tea with me this Friday afternoon? Jane Marple. She baked scones herself, raspberry jam, a fresh pot of lapsang, and a modest bouquet of tulips on the table, fresh, vivid, unmistakable. Mr. Grange arrived precisely at 4. He was taller than she remembered, with thinning hair and a rather evasive smile. Miss Marple, he said, inclining his head. Mr. Grange, she returned. Do sit down. I hope you like smoked tea. It has a way of revealing hidden flavours. As they spoke, Miss Marple watched. He was polite, composed, but tight. His fingers tapped at the saucer when he thought she wasn't looking. I hear you moved from Sussex, she said gently. Such a lovely part of the country. I had an old friend near Seaford. Did you? He replied. I suppose it has its charm. Did you know Nurse Phelps from there? He froze. Just a flicker. The teacup rattled as it touched the saucer. I met her briefly, through the chemist. Ah, yes. Pharmacists know many secrets, she said sweetly. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. After another few minutes, he stood. I'm afraid I must be going. Notes to review. Of course, Miss Marple said. But do come again. He nodded and left quickly, too quickly. She remained seated, the scones untouched. Outside, as twilight fell over the garden, she knew 2 things with certainty. Elias Grange had known Judith Phelps, and he had come to St. Leonard's Mead, not to write a book, but to erase a witness. The morning after Elias Grange's abrupt visit, Miss Marple sat in her rose-patterned armchair, hands folded neatly in her lap, staring at the bouquet of tulips still blooming on the table. It was not in her nature to rush matters. She preferred patience, like the slow steeping of tea leaves, until the flavour of truth revealed itself. But this time, there was a different pressure, an urgency threading beneath the quiet. Judith Phelps had left behind a warning, and now Miss Marple felt responsible for finishing what the young woman could not. By noon, Constable Hargreaves arrived, having received her brief but pointed note. She served him tea and handed him the paper scrap Judith had hidden in her herb book. She knew someone intended to harm her, Miss Marple said calmly. She feared that no one would believe her, and now we have the man she feared sitting only 3 cottages away. Hargreaves read the note again, more slowly this time. It isn't a confession, but it's something. It's motive, Miss Marple said, and intention. She could have meant anyone. She could have, but she didn't. Think of the letters she didn't post. One to Anthea Gray, her estranged friend, explaining that someone had followed her. Another, unaddressed save for a Brighton flat. And that evening, a man stands across from her garden, with gloves, and no one sees him again. Hargreaves exhaled, running a hand over his hair. I've got nothing concrete. Miss Marple nodded slowly. Then we shall need to catch him in his own web. I propose we ask a question no one's yet dared. He looked up. What's that? What if Nurse Phelps had gathered evidence? And what if Elias Grange believes she left it behind? Hargreaves blinked, the idea settling over him like a coat being gently draped across his shoulders. Then he might try to retrieve it. Miss Marple's smile was faint. Exactly, and we can help him believe that she did. That afternoon, they enacted the quietest of plays. Hargreaves paid a visit to the white cottage in full view of the lane, unlocked the front door, and stepped inside with a small brown parcel under his arm. 30 minutes later, he emerged, locked up, and walked back down Ash Lane with an extra purposeful air. Word travelled in St. Leonard's Mead as fast as the sparrows at dawn, and it wasn't long before the baker's assistant was telling the butcher's wife that the constable had found something significant at the dead woman's house. Miss Marple, meanwhile, made her usual walk to the greengrocer's, stopping to greet familiar faces along the way. It was during these idle conversations, beneath the surface of remarks about lettuce and weather, that she saw the effect begin to ripple. Mr. Grange had heard. His posture had changed, more taut, more watchful. She passed him near the footpath by the stream and gave him her most benign smile. Lovely weather, she said gently. He nodded stiffly. Yes, lovely. But his eyes were not on the sky. They were calculating. That evening, the white cottage was left dark but unlocked. Constable Hargreaves had hidden himself in the overgrown tool shed behind the trellis, his silhouette nearly invisible from the garden. Miss Marple had declined to join him, of course. Stakeouts were far too cold and muddy for her joints. But she waited at home, with the fire lit and the kettle just off boil, certain he would return before midnight. At 11:15, Hargreaves stepped into her sitting room and placed a small cloth-wrapped bundle on the table. He came, he said. Right after the lights went out all along Ash Lane, let himself in with gloves on, went straight to the writing desk. He rifled through every drawer, pulled up the rug under the armchair, opened the bookshelf. Did he find anything? Nothing but dust and your planted note behind the mirror. I watched his face when he read it. It shook him. Miss Marple allowed herself a soft nod. Then he knows someone else knows. There's enough now to bring him in for questioning, Hargreaves said. Suspicion, forced entry, motive, flight risk. No, she said, lifting her gaze. Not yet. We need him to believe he's safe just a bit longer. Long enough for something else to come loose. It always does. The next morning brought a new tremor through the village. Elias Grange had vanished. His little studio cottage stood with its curtains drawn and no answer to knocking. The landlord said he had paid the rent 2 weeks early and asked for no mail to be forwarded. All of this confirmed Miss Marple's suspicion. But it wasn't escape. It was movement. Grange hadn't fled. He'd gone to retrieve something, or someone. That same day, a telegram arrived for Miss Marple. It bore a Brighton postmark and a brief message from Anthea Gray. Thank you for your letter. I believe I should speak to you in person, coming Friday. A.G. Miss Marple arranged a simple tea for 2. Anthea Gray arrived precisely at 3. She was a woman of sharp eyes and sharp bones, dressed plainly, with a handbag clutched close to her side, as though it carried more than it ought to. "I wasn't sure if I should come," she said, accepting a cup of tea. "But your letter, and the news of Judith—" "You were once close," Miss Marple prompted. "Yes," she said softly. "We trained together, but we disagreed toward the end. She had taken a position with a very complicated family, the Stannings. She suspected, well, she told me something wasn't right with the medication. She feared the pharmacist. Elias Grange." Anthea nodded. "He was charming at first, then possessive. He had a way of making people feel watched. Judith said he had come to the house on his own, not for work, began showing up during her shifts." "Was she afraid?" "Yes. And when Mr. Stanning died suddenly, Judith swore something was wrong. She was let go quietly, told to forget it, but she never could." Miss Marple leaned forward. "Why did you fall out?" Anthea looked away. "I told her to leave it alone. I was scared for her, and for me." Miss Marple reached across gently and touched her hand. "You've done the right thing now." Anthea opened her handbag and removed a small object wrapped in tissue. A fountain pen, plain, elegant, its brass edges dulled with age. "She left this with me last time I saw her. Said it wasn't what it looked like. Said I should only give it up if something happened." Miss Marple turned it over in her hand. It was heavier than it should be. She twisted the top. A tiny reel of film slid out, tightly wound. "What is it?" Anthea asked. Miss Marple's voice was low. "I believe Judith left behind her own evidence, and now, at last, we may be able to see what she saw." That evening, Hargreaves took the pen and its contents to the county lab. The film was developed. It held a single photograph, grainy but clear enough. It showed a medicine cabinet and tucked just behind the labelled pill bottles, a small vial with no label. A hand held it. The man's face wasn't visible, but the cuff of his sleeve bore a monogram, E.G. Elias Grange. Miss Marple folded her hands. Now, she thought, the curtain could finally rise on the final act. Constable Hargreaves returned from the county lab the next morning with a tight jaw and a folder tucked beneath one arm. He stepped into Miss Marple's sitting room without waiting to be offered tea, an unusual sign of urgency from a man who normally waited until the second biscuit before broaching anything serious. "It's him," he said simply, laying the folder down on the side table. The film shows Elias Grange handling an unlabelled vial in Stanning's home, just days before the old man's death. The bottle matches the description of a rare tincture compound, foxglove derivative, prepared off prescription, no record of it ever being dispensed properly. Miss Marple gave a quiet nod, though her face revealed little triumph. "And no reason for a pharmacy assistant to be handling medications in a private home?" "None whatsoever." "Then it's not merely suspicion," she said. "It's evidence." "Enough to detain him, certainly," Hargreaves said. "But we've no idea where he's gone. He left no forwarding address. The cottage's key was returned, and all his belongings have been removed." "He's not gone far," Miss Marple murmured, half to herself. "Men like Grange seldom do. They stay near the fire they've lit, just in case the flames flare too high." Hargreaves looked puzzled, but he had long ago learned not to interrupt her metaphors. "We've issued an alert to the regional constabulary, but frankly, Jane, we may be a step behind." She leaned forward. "Then it's time to be clever. He'll need to know if we've found anything. That's the nature of guilt, you see. It wants to look over its shoulder. It can't help but try to measure the distance between itself and discovery. You want to flush him out. I want him to feel the fire." That very afternoon, a notice went up on the board outside the vicarage. "Memorial tea in honour of Miss Judith Phelps, Sunday at 3 p.m, White Cottage Garden." The words were quiet, respectful, but their timing was deliberate. No one in the village missed their implication. And if Elias Grange was watching, as Miss Marple suspected he would see it too. The next 3 days passed slowly, yet filled with quiet tension. Miss Marple was present at every stop along the village path, purchasing scones, collecting linens from the church committee, and placing fresh-cut flowers in the old basket Nurse Phelps had once used to fetch her post. Word of the event rippled outward, stirring sympathies and stoking speculation. By Saturday afternoon, a sighting came in. Mr. Nettleby, who kept the keys to the cricket shed and rarely left his bench by the green, told Constable Hargreaves that a man had passed by just after dusk. "Didn't look like a stranger," he said, "but didn't look right either. Wore his coat too tight and kept to the hedges. A man trying not to be seen, but unable to stay away." By Sunday morning, a storm threatened. Grey clouds roiled above the treetops, and a sharp breeze danced between the gravestones in the churchyard. Still, the villagers arrived, umbrellas in hand, drawn by equal parts respect and curiosity. Tea was laid out on trestle tables in the white cottage's back garden, china cups, simple sponge cake, and a single photograph of Judith placed in the centre, framed by lilies. Miss Marple stood by the table, her hands folded in front of her. She did not speak often, only now and then, offering a gentle word to someone who had known Judith in passing. Then, just after 3 o'clock, as she leaned down to straighten a teacup, her eyes flicked upward, and there he was, Elias Grange. He stood near the back gate, half concealed by a hawthorn bush, hands buried in his coat pockets. His eyes were scanning the crowd with the nervous energy of a man looking for someone who might know too much. Miss Marple didn't look at him directly. She simply nodded to Hargreaves, who had been sitting quietly on the garden bench beneath a laurel. The constable rose slowly and began to walk. Grange turned. He moved toward the alley behind the garden gate, but before he reached it, a second constable appeared from the other side. A young officer Hargreaves had brought up from the station that morning. The alley narrowed between the sheds and the wall, leaving Grange cornered. He froze, shoulders rising like a cat caught on the fence. Hargreaves stepped forward. "Mr. Grange, I'd like a word." Grange didn't respond. "You're not under arrest," the constable said, his tone even. "But we do have a few questions about your time in Sussex, and about Miss Phelps." Miss Marple watched from her place by the tea table. Grange turned slightly, his eyes flickering toward her, then away. There was no plea in his face, only calculation, but it was too late for calculation. Grange was escorted quietly away, the villagers none the wiser save for a few who guessed and whispered. Miss Marple continued serving tea as if nothing at all had happened, the storm clouds still grumbling overhead but holding. By evening, Hargreaves returned. "He confessed," he said, sinking into her armchair. "Not at first, but we laid out the photograph, the vial, the Sussex timeline. Eventually he said Judith had threatened to expose him, claimed it was just a warning dose, not meant to kill her, just to frighten her into silence." Miss Marple exhaled slowly. "But such things do not come with guarantees, do they?" "No," he said. He slipped it into her herbal tea, brought it himself, knew she took it after dinner, thought it would slow her pulse, make her faint, just enough to show she wasn't safe. "She must have realized," Miss Marple murmured. "She didn't drink it, or only sipped, but it was enough. Her body was already under stress. She wrote those letters right after, didn't post them, probably passed out not long after." He was quiet for a moment, then added, "She hid that note in the herb book just before, as if she knew the end might be near." Miss Marple nodded. "She was braver than most, and more clever. What will happen to him? He'll be charged, likely manslaughter at the very least, and an inquiry into Mr. Stanning's death will reopen." She poured him a cup of tea, her motions deliberate and calm. "There is something I've never quite understood about people like Grange," she said softly. "They believe they are entitled to the last word, that no one else is watching, that harm done in silence is never truly heard." "But it is," Hargreaves said. "Yes," she agreed. "It is." That night, St. Leonard's Mead returned to stillness. The white cottage stood quietly in its place, its windows dark, its garden trimmed, and its stories now passed into safer hands. And in her own cottage, Miss Marple returned to her knitting, the threads weaving gently in the lamplight. Justice, she thought, did not always come with noise. Sometimes it came with tulips and tea and the quiet certainty of truth uncovered at the right time. The wind had shifted slightly by morning. It carried the soft scent of peat and new grass through the hedgerows, brushing gently past open windows and rustling the leaves of St. Leonard's Mead with a kind of weary exhale, as though the village itself was letting out a long-held breath. In the little post office, letters clinked into metal trays. At the bakery, scones were dusted with sugar. And in the quiet lane beneath the ivy-covered wall of her garden, Miss Marple walked slowly, her basket resting lightly on one arm, her pace reflective. Elias Grange had been taken, the danger subdued, the questions answered, or nearly. For there always remained, in Miss Marple's experience, the matter of the afterward, the space no one quite knew how to occupy once a storm had passed. It was in that quiet that the real cost of a crime was often revealed, not in the moment of arrest, but in the faces of those left behind, with knowledge they hadn't asked to carry. She found herself thinking of Anthea Gray, a woman who had lived for months with a secret wrapped in guilt, a friend who had tried to protect Judith by encouraging her to forget, only to discover that silence could wound as surely as betrayal. Later that afternoon, Anthea returned to the white cottage for the first time since Judith's death. She asked Miss Marple to accompany her. They entered slowly, the old key turning in the lock with a soft click. The rooms were as they had been, though dust had settled and the air felt stiller than before. Anthea lingered in the front room where Judith's chair remained by the hearth. She didn't speak for a long while. "She always made tea just before sunset," Anthea said at last, her voice low. "It was her one indulgence," she used to say. "Not books, not sweets, just tea, always with lemon, no sugar." Miss Marple nodded gently. "I should have come sooner. I should have believed her." "You feared for her," Miss Marple said. "That is not the same as abandoning her. We mustn't conflate the two." Anthea looked down at her hands. "Do you think she knew what was happening?" "I believe," said Miss Marple softly, "that she suspected it, and she prepared for it in the only way she knew, by leaving clues. She wrote letters she never sent. She planted warnings she hoped someone might find." Anthea's eyes filled, but she nodded. "She trusted me enough to give me the pen." "And it made the difference," Miss Marple said. "It gave her back her voice." Outside, the clouds rolled lazily above the hedgerows, threatening rain but holding back, as if reluctant to disturb the moment. The next morning, Constable Hargreaves paid Miss Marple a final visit, this time with no folder, no news to deliver, only a small brown envelope. "Evidence being catalogued," he explained. "But I thought you might like to see this before it goes." Inside was a single sheet of paper, yellowed and creased at the edges. It was the note Judith had hidden behind the herb book, the one that had started it all. "I cannot keep this secret. If anything happens to me, it was not natural." Miss Marple read it once more, then folded it carefully and placed it back in the envelope. "She was very brave," Hargreaves said. "Yes," Miss Marple agreed, "but bravery is often quiet. It comes without witness or applause." He looked thoughtful. "I'm still struck by the idea that someone could do all that harm so calmly. He poisoned one man, maybe more, and then came here, just walked among us. It's not the poison that marks the villain," she said. "It's the calculation, the ability to watch someone suffer and do nothing, the desire to control without consequence." "Will there be a trial?" "There will be," she said, "but it will be quiet and tidy, and very likely he will plead to avoid exposure. It won't be dramatic. That part's already past." She offered him a biscuit, and he took it with a small nod, the matter settling gently into shared silence. The memorial tea, understated as it had been, left a lingering effect in the village. People passed the white cottage now with an unfamiliar reverence. Mrs. Edgeworth placed flowers outside the gate each week. Nothing elaborate, just a single lily or two. Even young Mary Leeming walked a little slower past it on her way home from school. And Miss Marple, in the evenings, sometimes sat by her own fire and thought not of Elias Grange, or even the trial to come, but of Judith Phelps, her discipline, her caution, her quiet determination to speak, even when her voice had been smothered. It was on one such evening, a week after the constable's last visit, that a small envelope arrived at Miss Marple's door. There was no return address, but the postmark read, Eastbourne. Inside was a note. Dear Miss Marple, I have little to offer in the way of closure, but I did want to thank you. What you did for Judith, what you uncovered, matters more than you know. I thought I had failed her. But because of you, her truth will live beyond the silence. With gratitude, A.G. Miss Marple placed the letter in her drawer beside the photograph of her late cousin Edward and a pressed forget-me-not from her garden. She lit a single lamp, drew the curtain, and sat once more in her chair. Outside, the village returned to its rhythms. New hedges were trimmed, new children were born, and new suspicions rose over the vicar's idea to install a car park near the churchyard. Life went on. But the threads of one story had been gathered and woven to their conclusion. Each knot tied with care, each whisper turned to voice. And Miss Marple, as ever, kept her watch. For though justice had been served this time, she knew, as surely as she knew how to turn a hem without breaking a stitch, that there would always be another thread, another silence, another shadow that needed untangling. She picked up her knitting. Outside, a sparrow began to sing. The village, for now, was at peace. A week later, beneath a soft morning drizzle, Miss Marple found herself walking past the white cottage once again, the path now familiar and strangely less heavy than before. A new notice had gone up on the garden gate, this one small and quietly printed. Property to be let. Inquiries to Hawthorne and Son, estate agents. Life, it seemed, had begun to move on, as it always did in villages like St. Leonard's Mead, gently, without permission, and often without a proper goodbye. Miss Marple paused by the gate. The lilies Mrs. Edgeworth had laid were browning at the edges, their stems bowed by the weight of the rain. She made a mental note to return later with something fresh. As she turned to leave, she noticed a small boy peering over the stone wall nearby. Tommy Barton, no more than 8, with muddy boots and a permanently smudged nose. "Morning, Miss Marple," he said shyly. "Good morning, Tommy," she replied with a smile. "Out early, aren't you?" He nodded. "Mum said I shouldn't come down this lane anymore. Not after what happened." Miss Marple's smile softened. "Well, that's sensible of her. But you mustn't be afraid. Bad things do happen from time to time, yes. But when people care enough to face them, the fear starts to fade." Tommy tilted his head, considering that. "Did you stop the bad man?" "I helped the people who did," she said. "Sometimes that's the best one can do." He grinned and darted off, the hem of his jumper flapping behind him. Miss Marple walked on toward the churchyard, where she had arranged to meet Vicar Goodchild for a short word about the upcoming spring fete. But as she turned into the narrow path by the vestry, she was surprised to find someone else already there, Anthea Gray, standing beneath the yew trees with her hands tucked into her coat, her eyes scanning the graves as though searching for one that hadn't been dug yet. "You came back," Miss Marple said gently. Anthea turned, offering a faint, weary smile. "I thought I should. I wasn't able to attend the service properly that day. I was too full of nerves." "You did more for Judith than most," Miss Marple said. "That's not forgotten." Anthea looked down. I've been wondering about something. That man, Grange, did he ever say why? Not just what he did, but why? Miss Marple was silent for a moment, then said, "He said he wanted control." Judith had seen through him. She threatened what little power he believed he had left. In his mind, he thought he was silencing a threat. But it was more than that. I believe she represented a kind of conscience he couldn't escape. Anthea sighed. It's terrible, isn't it? How some people fear being known more than being wrong. Miss Marple nodded. Quite. And some do unforgivable things just to keep the mirror from showing the truth. They walked a short while through the churchyard, passing under the flowering cherry trees, their pink petals wet and delicate against the grey stones. Anthea stopped before a blank patch of grass near the eastern wall. I was told they'd be placing a marker for Judith here, she said softly. No family to claim her, just this space. I imagine the village will come together to see it done, Miss Marple replied. She lived among us, and that's enough to earn remembrance. Anthea didn't speak again, but her shoulders relaxed a little, the way a person does when they've set down something too heavy to carry further. They parted quietly, and Miss Marple made her way home just as the rain eased into a mist. Back at her cottage, she received a visit from Mrs. Lavinia Gray, whose tea parties had so innocently marked the beginning of the entire ordeal. Mrs. Gray, as always, carried herself with an air of strained composure, though her hands fidgeted more than usual with the hem of her gloves. I wanted to thank you, Jane, she said after settling into the parlour chair. You've done a great deal for this village. People are talking about it everywhere. Even Mrs. Mott said she's reconsidering her choice of reading material. Something about your reminding her how important character observation is. Miss Marple chuckled lightly. I do believe we've all become a little more observant of late. Mrs. Gray hesitated, then leaned forward slightly. I don't suppose you've heard the latest rumour? Oh, you know I never indulge in rumours, Lavinia. But do go on. There's talk that the estate agents found something odd when they began preparing the white cottage for letting. Something in the floorboards beneath the armchair. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed just slightly. What sort of something? A small tin box. Locked. They haven't opened it yet. Waiting for the constable, apparently. Now that was unexpected. Miss Marple waited until Lavinia had gone before stepping once more into the drizzle, her umbrella tucked under her arm. She made her way straight to the constable's office, where Hargreaves looked up from a stack of reports with weary eyes. You've heard, I assume, he asked before she could speak. I have, she replied. Have you opened it? Just did this morning. Old tin. Locked, but not well. Inside were two things. A sealed envelope marked "In case of my death" and a folded clipping from a London newspaper, dated 3 years ago. He passed the clipping to her. It was short, a legal notice. Notice of suspension. Mr. Elias Grange, formerly employed at Pembury's Pharmacy, London, has been removed from the register of certified dispensers, pending investigation into allegations of falsified inventory records and patient risk. Below it, handwritten in Judith Phelps's careful script, was a single line. He will follow me. Miss Marple folded the clipping slowly. She knew it would not be over. Hargreaves nodded. The letter is longer. She wrote about Mr. Stanning, how she suspected tampering with the medication. She said she found the same label tampering in the Grange pharmacy as she later found in the Stanning household. That's what convinced her it was him. She'd pieced it together even before she left Sussex, Miss Marple murmured, but she feared that no one would believe a nurse over a man with credentials, even if those credentials were falling apart. She sent a copy of the letter to the Nursing Council too, Hargreaves said. Quietly, there's a record of it now, and thanks to her, any other quiet trail he left will be reopened. Miss Marple nodded solemnly, and that at least would have comforted her. As she left the constable's office, the bells from the church tower began their late afternoon chime. She stopped, for a moment on the edge of the green, watching the sparrows gather in the hedges. Later that evening, As the fire crackled softly and the rain gave way to a clear blue dusk, she added a new entry to her small brown ledger, the book where she kept only the briefest of notes from cases past. Judith Phelps, brave, careful, underestimated. Let silence be undone, and truth never outpaced by fear. She closed the book, reached for her knitting, and began a new row. Outside, the moon rose over the hedgerows, steady and untroubled. And in the village of St. Leonard's Mead, for the first time in many weeks, no one was watching their windows. No one kept vigil at the gate. The story at last had ended, but the knowing remained. And Miss Marple, as always, would be ready. A day or two passed with a quietness that felt almost foreign after so many weeks of tension and whispered speculation. The village of St. Leonard's Mead began to exhale, its nervous energy gradually giving way to cautious peace. The white cottage stood empty but dignified now, its story known, its silence no longer suspicious but reverent. Passers-by still glanced at it, yes, but no longer with fear. It had become a place of remembrance, not dread. Miss Marple, however, had not entirely let go. Something remained, a thread, fine and stubborn, like a single hair caught in the weave of her best shawl. It wasn't the question of guilt. Elias Grange's confession, the photograph, and Judith's hidden documents had more than established his responsibility. It wasn't the motive either, for though twisted, it was tragically human. Control, ego, fear of exposure. It was something smaller, something that had slipped past everyone in the flurry of resolution. She sat in her parlour that afternoon with a fresh pot of Darjeeling, the lemon scones untouched, her knitting still folded neatly in her lap. She wasn't quite thinking, not consciously. She was listening, to memory, to the edges of scenes replaying in her mind. The newspaper clipping, Judith's handwritten note, "He will follow me." The sealed letter and the timing of its discovery. It had all been so tidy. Too tidy. She rose and crossed the room, opening her small ledger once again. Beneath Judith's entry, she wrote one question. Did he really come alone? Later that evening, she penned a brief letter and had young Tommy Barton deliver it to the constable's office. The note read, "Would you be so kind as to check for known associates of Mr. Elias Grange during his time at Pembury's pharmacy? Particularly anyone dismissed shortly before or after his departure. A small detail may yet matter." The reply came the next morning. Hargreaves arrived at her doorstep, looking not harried but intrigued. "You're not going to like this," he said, accepting the seat she offered. "I rarely do when I've asked the right question," she replied. "There was a woman," he said, "Celia Trent, employed at the same pharmacy as Grange. Records show she worked as a dispensing assistant for nearly 5 years. Resigned the same week he was suspended." Miss Marple's fingers closed slightly around the edge of her teacup. "And where is Miss Trent now?" Hargreaves hesitated. "Living in a bedsit in Eastbourne. No listed occupation. But here's the bit that caught my attention. Her name came up recently in a prescription audit. Seems she attempted to refill an unusual compound at a private chemist's under a false name. Digitalis? Yes, nearly identical formula to the one Grange used. Claimed it was for her mother's arrhythmia, but there was no prescription, and the pharmacist flagged it." Miss Marple sat back, her eyes narrowing. "Did she visit the village?" Hargreaves shook his head. "No known visits, no sightings, but she and Grange were close. Some thought romantically. Others said she was simply loyal to him in an odd, quiet sort of way. A person doesn't have to appear in a place to influence it," Miss Marple said. "If Judith Phelps knew Grange would follow her, it's possible she also feared someone helping him, someone even more discreet." She stood and paced a little, something she rarely did. "There's something about the envelope in the floorboards," she said. "Too well hidden for a hurried placement. And yet, the photograph, the most damning evidence, was kept in the pen, passed to Anthea. Why not place everything in the floorboard tin? You're thinking she was forced to hide it in haste? No, Miss Marple replied, turning back toward him. I think someone else placed it there. Hargreaves straightened. But who? I believe, she said carefully, that Elias Grange did not come to the White Cottage that final night to search. He came to retrieve. Hargreaves stared at her for a long moment. And he didn't find what he was looking for. No, she said, because someone had already taken it. And then, knowing we'd search again, returned it. Created the illusion that Judith had hidden it herself. He rubbed his chin. That's a dangerous game. It is, she said. But it also protects Grange's accomplice. If the key evidence appears as if left by the victim, no one looks for a second hand. And now that Grange is in custody, he can't speak, Miss Marple finished quietly. Or rather, won't. Because if she helped him and he protects her, it remains his game, his legacy. That sort of man clings to loyalty, especially when it serves his own sense of cleverness. The storm that had threatened for days finally broke, rain streaking the windows with a slow rhythm. Miss Marple moved to the sideboard, where the unopened letter from Judith still sat in the envelope Constable Hargreaves had shown her, but not yet handed over in full. I wonder, she murmured, if there's more still in there. With care, Hargreaves slid it out again. They had read its beginning, but not the entirety. Judith had written with precision. The penmanship never faltered, even as the tone grew more urgent. Near the final paragraph, a new name appeared. If something should happen to me, I beg you to consider the possibility that Elias Grange may not have acted alone. I suspected a woman once linked to him, a Miss Celia Trent. She was not involved directly in Mr. Stanning's death, but she supported Grange's false paperwork and continued to vouch for him. I saw her outside the Stanning residence once, though she denied it. She frightens me more than he does. He is impulsive. She is cold. Miss Marple drew a slow breath. There it is. I'll request a formal interview, Hargreaves said, and I'll speak to Eastbourne Police immediately. She won't break easily, Miss Marple said. She's not a shadow figure by accident. The constable left as the rain deepened, promising swift action, and Miss Marple, left once more in her quiet parlour, sat back with a new stillness. It was not satisfaction. It was completion. The difference between solving a crime and understanding all of its ripples. She had known from the beginning that Judith Phelps had left more than clues. She had left direction. Her caution, her silence. It had never been out of fear alone. It had been a strategy. And now, even after death, she had guided them to the last name that mattered. That evening, Miss Marple lit the single lamp beside her chair and picked up her ledger again. Beneath her previous entry, she added 2 lines. Celia Trent, still hidden. Watch for her shadow in the garden. She closed the book, the fire murmuring low beside her. There was, she thought, something about evil that was rarely theatrical. It crept in with quiet sympathy, disguised as care, as concern, as loyalty. It never wore a mask. It wore a smile, and it stood one step behind the one who took the blame. The storm passed by midnight, leaving the village washed and hushed. In the early hours, a knock came to the door of the Eastbourne bedsit, where Celia Trent had lived in anonymity. And when she opened it, poised, composed, her eyes unreadable, she already knew who was there. The hallway of the Eastbourne bedsit building smelled faintly of dust and old linoleum, the sort of smell that lingered through seasons, immune to fresh paint and polite tenants. When the knock sounded, it was not loud nor demanding. It was measured, but it was the sort of knock that expected an answer. Celia Trent opened the door slowly. She wore a dove-grey jumper and a pair of reading glasses she did not need. Her hair was drawn back in a careful bun, her expression composed. Only the brief flicker in her eyes, just for a second, betrayed that she had been waiting for this moment. She didn't ask who they were. "You're here about Elias," she said simply. Constable Hargreaves stepped forward with his badge. Miss Trent, we'd like to speak with you about your involvement in the matter concerning Mr. Elias Grange and the late Miss Judith Phelps. May we come in? Celia hesitated, then opened the door wider. The flat was spotless. Too spotless. Every surface polished, every book aligned, every cup rinsed and dried. A single pot of rosemary sat on the windowsill, and on the mantel was a photograph, an old one, of herself and Elias, standing in front of a pharmacy, smiling. She did not offer them tea. Where shall we begin? She asked, folding her hands. Hargreaves remained standing. With Pembury's pharmacy, the falsified inventory. You left your position the same week Mr. Grange was suspended. There was nothing left to stay for, she replied. They were already whispering. They assumed I'd known. Hadn't you? She tilted her head. I hadn't seen the bottle, but I'd seen Elias's work before, and I knew he was creative. And yet you protected him. She met his gaze evenly. Not out of romance. Don't mistake it for that. Elias believed people were weak, that they shouldn't be trusted with their own health. I disagreed, but I admired how precise he was. He never rushed, never panicked. He understood power. Miss Phelps died, Hargreaves said, his voice flat. Celia's eyes darkened. Yes, she did. Did you assist in her death? No. But you helped Elias Grange conceal his involvement in Mr. Stanning's. I said nothing, she replied. And yes, that's the same as helping. There was a long pause, broken only by the sound of a clock ticking near the bookshelves. We believe you recovered evidence from the White Cottage, Hargreaves continued. The sealed tin hidden beneath the floorboard. We believe it wasn't placed there by Judith Phelps at all, but by you, after Elias failed to retrieve it. For the first time, Celia's eyes drifted away. I knew there would be a second search, she said quietly. I watched the garden the night he went in. I was never far. When he came back empty-handed, I knew the photograph must have been somewhere else. But that tin, I thought it might divert things, give him time to decide what to do. But time ran out. Yes, Hargreaves studied her. Why return the tin at all? You could have destroyed it. I considered it, she said. But then I read the letter inside. Judith's letter. It was too exact, too calm. I realized something. What? She wasn't writing it for the police. She was writing it for someone who would understand her. Someone like Miss Marple. Back in St. Leonard's Mead, Miss Marple stood in her front garden tying back the last of the foxgloves with twine. The storm had battered them into a lean, and she moved with gentle care as she coaxed them upright. When the telephone rang inside, she knew before answering who it would be. It's done, Hargreaves said. She confessed to withholding evidence, to supporting Elias during the Stanning case, and to returning the tin to mislead the investigation. Will it lead to formal charges? Yes. Aiding and abetting, obstruction, possibly conspiracy tied to the Stanning case. Miss Marple was quiet for a moment. And what of her tone? Cold, but not cruel. She seemed more tired than anything. I think she believed she was preserving something, Miss Marple said softly. Not Elias, precisely. Perhaps an idea of him, or of control, the illusion that she could still manage the outcome, even as it collapsed. There was a long pause. She was more dangerous than he was, Hargreaves said. Yes, Miss Marple agreed, because she understood exactly what she was doing. When the call ended, she stood at the window and looked toward the White Cottage. A new couple had inquired about renting it, the estate agent had said. Young, newly married, the sort who might paint the door a bright colour and plant wildflowers in the back. It gave her comfort somehow to know it would be lived in again. The house had held enough silence. That evening, Miss Marple received a letter by post. It was from Anthea Gray, now back in Brighton. A short, handwritten note on plain stationery. I read in the paper that there's been another arrest. I suppose this is what justice looks like. Quiet, inevitable, complicated. I wanted you to know that I've joined the Patient Advocacy Board here in Brighton. It's not much, but it feels like a beginning. I think Judith would have liked that. With sincere thanks, Anthea Miss Marple placed the letter beside her teacup and sat down to write in her ledger one final time under the name of Judith Phelps. Justice did not knock loudly, but it came. It walked in soft shoes, held its breath through storm and silence, and waited until the garden bloomed again. She closed the book. Outside, the first stars began to appear above St. Leonard's Mead. A breeze lifted the curtains, as if airing out the last of the grief. Children laughed in the distance. Someone lit a chimney fire, and the bells from the church tower marked the hour with quiet grace. Miss Marple poured a final cup of tea and resumed her knitting. And for the first time in many weeks, the yarn ran smooth and untangled through her fingers. The spring fete arrived at last in St. Leonard's Mead, as it always did, bright bunting strung between cottages, lemon drizzle cake judiciously judged in the tent beside the church, and the faint, pleasing scent of cut grass carried on the breeze. No one spoke of Elias Grange anymore. His trial had passed with barely a headline beyond the circuit courts. Celia Trent's name had never even reached the local papers. The village, in its quiet way, had absorbed the scandal and let it settle beneath its surface, where old things softened with time and new things took root. Miss Marple sat at a small table near the rose stall, a book in her lap, though she wasn't reading. She watched the children tumbling past the bunting and the older couples haggling gently over potted lavender. Beside her, a basket of knitted socks she'd donated to the Women's Guild raffle sat half-emptied. It was, she thought, a day for peace. But peace didn't always mean forgetting. Vicar Goodchild strolled past and stopped beside her with a paper cup of lemonade. "Rather good turnout this year," he said cheerfully. "I believe the jam stall has already sold out." "Mrs. Swithins puts brandy in her raspberry," Miss Marple replied without looking up. "It's practically a tonic." The vicar chuckled and sat beside her. After a moment he added, "It was a long winter, wasn't it?" She nodded slowly. "Longer than most." He didn't ask for details. He didn't need to. The village knew what had happened, even if it didn't always say it aloud. And perhaps, Miss Marple thought, that was for the best. People did not need to live inside the shadow of a crime to honour its truth. When the raffle began, she excused herself gently and walked down Ash Lane, away from the fete. The path curved gently beneath a row of young beech trees, their new leaves still a tender green. It led, eventually, to the white cottage. She paused at the gate. It had been freshly painted a soft blue. Tulips now bloomed along the front path, taller and stronger than the ones Judith had left behind. A pram was parked just inside the fence, and a woman's voice called faintly from inside, singing, not words, just the gentle melody of contentment. Miss Marple stood very still. Then she smiled, not with triumph, but with something gentler, recognition perhaps. Life had returned. She made her way back home as the sun sank into a soft gold haze, catching the edges of window panes and warming the bricks of every cottage it touched. That evening, as she folded the last of her laundry and placed it on the spare room bed, her hand brushed across a small, pale envelope. It was the final letter from Judith Phelps, never posted, never read, and now passed to her by the constable with no legal need to retain it. The handwriting was as neat as ever. To the one who finds this, I was never brave with words, but I believe that the smallest truths matter. I believe someone will understand what I tried to leave behind. I was afraid, yes, but I was also certain, and I could not, would not, let him go on. If this letter has reached you, it means the truth has walked far enough, that someone listened. Thank you for hearing me. Judith Phelps. Miss Marple folded the letter slowly, pressing the crease with the flat of her hand. She placed it back in its envelope and returned it to her desk drawer, beside the sprig of dried rosemary she'd taken from the white cottage before the garden was replanted. Outside, the last sparrows rustled in the hedges, and the lamplighter made his gentle rounds. The case was closed. Justice had been served, not with spectacle, but with care, with watchfulness, and with quiet persistence. Judith's voice had not been lost. It had been passed from hand to hand until it landed where it needed to. Miss Marple poured one last cup of tea and sat by her fire, knitting in her lap, the room warm and dim and utterly still. She would rest tonight, but she would watch again tomorrow.